Joe Martinez was cutting specialist Tim Morrison's hair when the conversation started. It was a Tuesday morning, 0930 hours, at the Base Barbershop at Joint Base Lewis McChord, Washington. Morrison sat in the chair, scrolling through his phone, while Joe worked the clippers across the back of his head. The barbershop was small, 3 chairs, old magazines on a side table, the smell of aftershave and disinfectant. Joe had worked here for 22 years. Same building, same routine, 5 days a week, 800 to 1,700 hours. He was 63 years old now. Brown skin, weathered by time. Hands steady despite his age. He spoke little, kept to himself, did his job with quiet professionalism. The soldiers who came through barely noticed him. He was just Joe, the barber, part of the base infrastructure, as permanent and unremarkable as the buildings themselves. Another soldier walked in, Corporal Jake Stevens, also from the 3rd Brigade. He dropped into the waiting chair and immediately started talking. "Yo, Morrison, you hear about the convoy change?" Morrison looked up from his phone. "What change?" "Route hammer. They moved it up. Instead of Friday, we're rolling Thursday morning. 0600 departure." Joe's hands kept moving, clippers buzzing steadily. His expression didn't change. He didn't look up. "Seriously?" Morrison said. "I thought command wanted to wait for better weather." "Yeah. Well, somebody higher up pushed it. Supply chain issues or something. We got to get those parts to Bagram ASAP." Morrison shook his head. "Thursday morning sucks. That's when the locals are moving to market. Route's going to be packed with civilian traffic." "I know, man, but orders are orders." Joe worked silently, trimming around Morrison's ears with practiced precision. 22 years of cutting hair had made the motions automatic. He could do this in his sleep. Stevens pulled out his phone, scrolling through something. "Hey, you remember that spot where we got hit last year? Mile marker 47. "Yeah, the bridge approach. IED took out the lead vehicle, killed Sergeant Parker. Command still hasn't cleared that area properly. We're rolling right through it again. Same route, same vulnerability." Morrison sighed. "Did they at least add more vehicles to the convoy?" "Nope. For trucks, just like last time. They said we don't have the resources for a larger security element." Joe finished Morrison's haircut. He brushed off the soldier's shoulders with a small towel, removed the cape, and accepted payment. Morrison left without really looking at him. Stevens moved to the chair. "Same as last time, Joe?" "Yes," Joe said quietly, his accent slight. "Short on the sides?" "Yeah, thanks, man." Joe began working, and Stevens made a phone call. His voice was casual, relaxed. He wasn't thinking about operational security. Wasn't considering who might be listening. "Yeah, it's me. Listen, we're moving out Thursday instead of Friday." "Yeah, 0600. Route hammer. Same as the last mission." "I know, right? They never learn." "Mile marker 47. That's the danger zone. For vehicles, minimal security." "Yeah, it's stupid, but what can you do?" When Stevens finished his haircut and left, Joe stood alone in the barbershop, holding his clippers, staring at nothing. 22 years he'd been listening. 22 years of soldiers sharing information they didn't realize mattered. Deployment dates, unit movements, convoy routes, tactical details. Most of it was harmless. Routine conversations. Young soldiers talking to friends, sharing frustrations, discussing their work. But this was different. Joe had heard this pattern before. Convoy routes discussed openly. Timeline changes mentioned casually. Vulnerabilities identified but not addressed. And last time he'd heard this pattern, people had died. Joe set down his clippers and walked to the small office in the back of the shop. He sat at an old desk and opened a laptop that had seen better days. For the first time in 22 years, Joe Martinez was going to break his silence. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Army Story so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Joe stared at the blank document on his screen for a long moment. Then he began typing. Threat analysis, route hammer supply convoy. Source, multiple HUMINT indicators. Confidence level, High. Timeline, 72 hours. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. This wasn't his first intelligence report. It had just been a very long time since he'd written one. Joe Martinez hadn't always been a barber. 22 years ago, before he'd taken this job at Joint Base Lewis McChord, Joe had worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency. DIA, Human Specialist, Human Intelligence. 15 years in Latin America, mostly. Colombia, Venezuela, Panama. Places where information meant survival, and the wrong word at the wrong time could get you killed. He'd been good at his job. Very good. He spoke 4 languages fluently, could blend into almost any environment, and had an eidetic memory that made him invaluable in the field. But 15 years of that life had worn him down. The stress, the danger, the moral compromises. When his retirement came through in 2001, Joe had been ready to leave that world behind. He'd wanted something quiet, something peaceful, something where he didn't have to lie about who he was or what he did. He'd found the barbershop position through a veterans employment program, a civilian contractor role on a military base. Good pay, decent benefits, and most importantly, no field work, no danger, no intelligence operations, just cutting hair. For 22 years, that's exactly what he'd done. He'd kept his head down, done his work, and tried very hard to forget the person he used to be. But you don't unlearn 15 years of intelligence training. You don't forget how to recognize patterns, how to assess threats, how to piece together information from disparate sources. And when you spend 22 years in a barbershop on a military base, you hear a lot of conversations. At first, Joe had tried to ignore them, tried to treat them as background noise. But his training wouldn't let him. His mind automatically cataloged information, sorted it, analyzed it. Over the years, he'd heard thousands of conversations. Soldiers discussing deployments, unit movements, tactical operations. Officers complaining about command decisions. Intelligence personnel sharing classified details they shouldn't. Joe never reported any of it, never shared what he heard. He'd left that life behind, and he intended to keep it that way. But this was different. Joe finished typing his threat assessment. 3 pages, formatted like a professional intelligence document. He included timeline, Thursday, 0600 hours. Location, route hammer, specifically mile marker 47. Vulnerability assessment, bridge approach, previous IED activity, inadequate security element. Enemy capability, pattern suggested coordinated ambush, likely IED followed by small arms fire. Recommended countermeasures, route change, increased security presence, or mission delay. He saved the document, printed it, and placed it in a manila folder. Then he sat back and stared at it. If he submitted this report, people would ask questions. How did a barber know about convoy operations? How did he produce a professional threat assessment? Who was Joe Martinez, really? His quiet life would be over. The anonymity he'd cultivated for 22 years would disappear. But if he didn't submit it, and that convoy got hit, Joe thought about Sergeant Parker, killed last year at mile marker 47, 24 years old. Joe had cut his hair 2 days before he died. He thought about all the soldiers he'd watched come and go over 22 years. The young ones who'd never been deployed. The veterans with hard eyes and old scars. The ones who'd never come back. Joe picked up the folder and stood. Some things were more important than a quiet life. The intelligence office at Joint Base Lewis McChord was in a secure building near the command center. Joe had walked past it thousands of times, but had never gone inside. Major Tom Richards, the base intelligence officer, looked up from his desk to find an old man standing in his doorway. "Can I help you?" Richards asked. "I need to report a threat," Joe said quietly. Richards sighed. "Base security got walk-ins all the time. Usually nothing. What's your name?" "Joe Martinez. I work in the base barbershop." Richards blinked. "Joe, the barber." Everyone knew Joe. "All right, Joe. What threat are you reporting?" Joe stepped forward and placed a folder on Richards' desk. "There's going to be an attack on the route hammer convoy, Thursday morning, approximately mile marker 47. Richards opened the folder and started reading. His expression shifted from polite skepticism to genuine surprise to serious concern. The document was professional, detailed, well-formatted. This wasn't some rambling conspiracy theory. "Joe," Richards said slowly, "where did you get this information?" "I heard it." "You heard it? From who?" "From soldiers. In the barbershop. Over the past 3 weeks." Richards stared at him. "Soldiers talking in your barbershop told you there would be an attack?" "No," Joe said patiently. "They didn't say there would be an attack. But they talked about the convoy, the route, the timing, the vulnerabilities. And I recognized the pattern." "What pattern?" Joe met his eyes. "I've been cutting hair on this base for 22 years, Major. I've heard a lot of conversations. And sometimes, when you listen long enough, you start to see things nobody else sees." Richards looked at the assessment again. The detail was impressive. The analysis was sound. But this was a barber. "Joe, with all due respect, intelligence analysis isn't something you just pick up from listening to haircut conversations." "No," Joe agreed. "It's something you learn from 20 years of training." "Training." Joe was quiet for a moment. "Then, before I came here, I worked for DA, Defense Intelligence Agency, Human Specialist. 15 years in Latin America. Then I retired. Wanted something quiet. Got a job cutting hair." Richards felt his understanding of reality shift slightly. "You're telling me you're a retired intelligence officer?" "Was," Joe corrected. "Now I'm a barber. I don't work for DIA anymore. But I still know how to recognize patterns. And Major, the patterns I'm seeing suggest that convoy is going to get hit." Richards studied him. Joe looked like exactly what he was supposed to be, an old man who cut hair. But his eyes were different now, alert, assessing. The eyes of someone who'd spent decades evaluating threats. "Why now?" Richards asked. "If you've been here 22 years, why are you reporting this now?" Joe's expression was sad. "Because for 22 years, I've listened to soldiers talk. And sometimes they share information they shouldn't. Most of the time, it doesn't matter. But sometimes," he gestured at the folder, "sometimes people die because information leaks. And I'm tired of cutting hair for soldiers who don't come back." Richards made a decision. "Wait here." He picked up his phone and called Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the base commander. "Ma'am, I have a situation you need to see." 20 minutes later, Joe sat in Mitchell's office, explaining everything again. Mitchell listened, asked pointed questions, and examined the threat assessment with a professional eye. "Mr. Martinez," she said finally, "if you're right and we ignore this warning, people will die. But if you're wrong and we cancel or reroute this convoy based on information from a barbershop, that's a significant operational disruption." "I understand, Colonel. I'm going to ask you directly. How confident are you in this assessment?" Joe thought about Specialist Morrison and Corporal Stevens, about the casual way they'd shared operational details, about the pattern he'd seen emerging over weeks of similar conversations. 85%, he said. "In intelligence work, that's as certain as you ever get." Mitchell nodded slowly. Then she picked up her phone. "Cancel the Thursday convoy. Reschedule for Saturday, different route. And I want increased security on whatever route we choose." After Joe left, Richard stayed behind. "Ma'am, if he's telling the truth about his background, we need to verify it. And we need to understand how much classified information has been compromised over 22 years. "Agreed. Pull his personnel file. And Major, start an OPSEC investigation. If soldiers have been sharing operational details in a barbershop for 2 decades, we have a much bigger problem than one convoy." The verification came back within 48 hours. Joe Martinez, age 63, retired from DIA in 2001 after 15 years of service. Multiple commendations. Spotless record. Security clearance still technically active, though dormant. The man was exactly who he said he was. And on Thursday morning at 0730 hours, a surveillance drone spotted an enemy force staged near mile marker 47 of Route Hammer. 15 fighters with IEDs and small arms, waiting for a convoy that never came. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell called Joe into her office that afternoon. "Mr. Martinez, your intelligence was accurate. The enemy was exactly where you said they'd be, at exactly the time you predicted. You saved lives today." Joe nodded quietly. "Thank you, Colonel. I have a question. Over 22 years, how many other conversations like this have you heard? How many times have soldiers shared operational information in your barbershop?" Joe was quiet for a long moment. "Hundreds of times, Colonel. Maybe thousands." Mitchell's expression hardened. "And you never reported any of it?" "No, ma'am. I retired from intelligence work. I wanted a quiet life. And most of what I heard was harmless, soldiers talking about routine operations, discussing their work. Nothing that would compromise security. But this time was different. This time, I recognized a pattern that meant people would die if I stayed silent. I couldn't live with that." Mitchell studied him. "Mr. Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you. You've just exposed a significant OPSEC vulnerability on this base. For 22 years, soldiers have been treating your barbershop like it's a private space, sharing information that should never leave secure areas. That's on us, not you. But now that we know about it, we have to address it." "I understand. I'm implementing new OPSEC protocols immediately. Mandatory briefings. Reminders about information security. We're going to make it very clear that walls have ears, even in barbershops." Joe nodded. "That's wise, Colonel. But I have another question. Would you be willing to consult for us? Not full-time, not officially. But if you hear patterns, see threats, recognize problems, would you be willing to report them?" Joe hadn't expected that. "Colonel, I'm a barber. I'm not an intelligence officer anymore." "Mr. Martinez, you may have retired from DIA, but you still have one of the most valuable intelligence positions on this base. You have access to information that we don't, not because you're stealing it, but because soldiers trust you enough to talk freely around you. That's an asset we'd be foolish to waste." Joe thought about it. For 22 years, he tried to be invisible, tried to leave his old life behind. But maybe that was never really possible. Maybe some skills never go away. And maybe, in his own quiet way, he could still serve. "On one condition," Joe said. "My cover stays intact. I'm still just Joe the barber. Nobody knows except you and Major Richards. If soldiers find out I'm reporting their conversations, they'll stop talking. And then I'm useless to you." Mitchell nodded. "Agreed. This stays between us." Over the next 3 years, Joe Martinez continued cutting hair at Joint Base Lewis McChord. To everyone on base, he was still the same quiet old man he'd always been. But every few months, a report would appear on Major Richards' desk. A threat assessment, a security vulnerability, a pattern that suggested problems. Joe saved 3 more convoys from ambush, identified 2 soldiers who were sharing classified information with foreign contacts, detected a pattern of equipment theft that led to the arrest of a supply sergeant selling to black market dealers. All of it from conversations in a barbershop, from soldiers who forgot that walls have ears, from a man who'd spent 22 years listening to everything. In 2018, Joe finally retired. He was 70 years old, and his hands were starting to shake too much for precision haircuts. On his last day, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, now Colonel Mitchell, presented him with a Civilian Service Award. For 22 years of dedicated service to Joint Base Lewis McChord, the citation read, "For professionalism, integrity, and exceptional contributions to base security." Most people who attended the small ceremony assumed it was a generic retirement award. They didn't know what Joe had really done, didn't know about the intelligence reports, the saved lives, the threats neutralized. Only 3 people knew the truth: Colonel Mitchell, Major Richards, and Joe himself. After the ceremony, a young private approached Joe. "Mr. Martinez, I just wanted to say thanks. You cut my hair my first week on base, when I was nervous and didn't know anyone. You were kind. I'll remember that." Joe smiled. "Good luck, Private. Stay safe." As Joe walked away from the barbershop for the last time, he thought about all the soldiers he'd met over 22 years. Thousands of haircuts, thousands of conversations, thousands of young men and women passing through his chair. Most of them never knew who he really was. Never knew that the quiet old man cutting their hair was listening, assessing, protecting. And that was exactly how it should be. Today, at the DIA headquarters in Washington, D.C., there's a plaque in a restricted hallway. It lists names of intelligence officers who served with distinction in non-traditional roles. Near the bottom, in small letters, Joe Martinez, Humant, Barbershop Operations, 2001 to 2018. The greatest intelligence asset isn't always the one in the shadows gathering secrets. Sometimes it's the one in plain sight that everyone overlooks, the one who's been listening to everything for 22 years. Moral of the story: never underestimate the invisible people around you. The person you dismiss as unimportant might be the most observant person in the room. And remember, walls have ears, even in places you think are safe. Operational security isn't just about classified briefings. It's about remembering that someone is always listening. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Army Story for more true tales of courage, sacrifice, and the heroes who serve in unexpected ways, proving that intelligence work isn't always about James Bond-style operations. Sometimes it's about a quiet man in a barbershop who never forgot his training. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the heroes among us.